Right, Alistair. Let's talk about the book that you have created, which I have in front of me here, The Key Elements for Business Agility.
Look at that.
What was your aim behind the book? What's the purpose of the book?
Purpose. I think the first reason for writing it was actually to get my own thoughts organized. Because the world of agile is quite big, and there's a lot of moving parts. And I wanted to understand for myself what I meant by what does it mean to be agile,
Mhm.
and I wanted to be able to describe it to people who were not in the project management field, or who were not in the software field, or who didn't know anything about it. So I was kind of looking for that, and that was the starting point, I think, for the book. And then what happened was, these themes started to appear as I was writing it, and the themes became what I refer to as the elements,
Mhm.
and those are each one of them are sort of a way of working, a way of looking at the world, a way of thinking that helps us to be more agile, as we are approaching a task or something that we're doing together.
Okay. And who are you aiming at with the book? Who should read this?
So originally, I was trying to get my thoughts together so I could explain it to anybody. So anybody who would say, "Well, Alistair, what is agile? What are you talking about?" I
Mhm.
could explain it to them. And I think it's aimed at anybody who is looking to um, solve a problem, innovate, or just do the work that they're doing in a simpler, more natural way, so that they can get to the outcome faster and more effectively. So really, anybody who is looking to achieve something. So I use the elements. I use them to when I'm practicing my saxophone. I use them when I'm cooking. I use elements of that when I'm planning, a trip. When anything I'm doing, I'm thinking about those elements, and how I can make what I'm doing simpler and easier and more effective.
So we're not simply talking about agile in the kind of sense that it's come up of software development and that kind of thing. We're talking about a broader
I,
image.
I think a broader approach, because I think it works for anything.
Mhm.
And if the tagline that I have in there is about us being naturally agile, that we are
Yeah.
possibly born agile. And I think that if we observe children approaching a problem or approaching a task, and if we observe ourselves as we work on our hobbies instead of our jobs, for example, we just will experiment and figure it out, and
Yeah.
move forward, and deliver it. So yes, it's beyond software for sure. It's beyond just business even. I think it's something that we can use, just it's just our natural way of doing something.
But you use the phrase business agility in the title.
Yes.
So what does business agility mean for you?
So business. The reason for it being about business agility is, I think that's the sort of the starting point, for a lot of people, because if we can solve our problems in the work environment, if we can work, we can improve our ways of working in the work environment, that then spills over into our life outside of work. So for sure, I'm looking at helping people to have a better work experience, a work life experience, so that they can have a better home life experience, by being able to deliver on the thing and not have to spend hours and hours and hours doing it, and late into the night and long weekends and all those sorts of things. So that's why I think I'm at the moment focusing on the business
Yeah.
piece.
Mhm.
But for sure, there are many arguments to suggest that, it could have had a different title. It's probably exactly the same book almost, but with a different title, which was, more everyday, maybe.
But you're wanting to get businesses, organizations that don't necessarily know what the agile philosophy is, you're wanting to get them involved in looking at how they work as teams, etc., and get that more efficient.
Yes, absolutely, is what I'm looking to do. And the reason for that is that I think that most of us who are working in organizations, those organizations are there to solve problems, to solve human
Yeah,
problems. That's why we create businesses,
absolutely.
to innovate, solve problems, and so on. And I think that if we can do that faster than we currently, even faster than we currently are. I mean, we humans are extraordinary. We have almost an infinite capacity for problem solving, almost an infinite capacity for innovation, and especially if we collaborate, especially if we spark ideas off of each other and work in groups together. And so what I'm looking to do is to remove the blockers. What I'm suggesting to people is they can remove the blockers that exist, which impede the flow of ideas between brains, so that we can get to those solutions, even faster than we already have, and solve more problems than we already are. And again, we're doing an extraordinary job already, but what if we could do this 5, 10, 15 times faster?
How do the elements then that you identify in the book, how do they help us do that?
So with each of the elements, what I've done is I've identified how the element helps us get to an outcome faster. So each
Hmm.
element is written. The elements I picked are the ones that will help us get to an outcome faster. They are Each element will help improve the flow of ideas between brains. And thirdly, what I'm looking at is how each element helps reduce risk. So, what I mean by risk is project risk, business risk, and so on. So,
Hmm.
each of the elements that I have listed uh, try and tackle those 3 points. And that's been that's how I've tried to organize the book so that we understand what we're doing in there, how we can get there faster in for each of them. Now, you don't need all 21 elements to do something. One of them, just picking one element and applying that, will improve our ability to get to an outcome faster, will improve the flow of ideas, and will improve our risk management. Any one of them will do that. You start combining 2, 3, and 4, and it really gets quite interesting. But I'm not expecting anybody to go out and learn all 12, all 21 in one go, and that you have to do all 21 to make anything work. That's not the case.
How then should we select which elements we want to work with? Do we just pick at random? How would we get to these 3 or 4 elements that we might want to focus on?
Sure. So at the beginning of the book, I actually put a couple of suggestions as to how we can get started. I've got a little quick scan, a quick questionnaire in there,
Mm.
and I think scanning through that questionnaire, it's 15 quick questions or 15 statements. That will probably draw you to a
Okay.
particular element that is quite fascinating or interesting. I think the idea is that you can look at Agile through any one of the 21 elements or any one of the 21 lenses, if you will. And I think what I'm suggesting to people is go for the one that you feel is most appropriate right now, that resonates with you right now. So it may be one that you feel very comfortable with,
Mhm.
or it may be one that you feel least comfortable with and you want to feel like you need to tackle that. Some of them are super, super easy to implement. Some of them probably take a little bit more thinking. So I think start wherever you feel comfortable. And what I have found is that as you start with one, you start to look at a second and then a third and then a fourth. And
Yeah.
there's a sort of a domino effect because you just find that oh, I now need that thing and that one. And the beauty of it is if you pick one and it's just not helping in any way, then you've got 20 more to pick from, um, to go for. So
And that leads me to one of the questions I had when I was reading the book. The first element you call outcomes, and
mm,
you make a distinction between outcomes and outputs.
yeah.
So what does that distinction mean, and why is that important?
So what I'm saying there is that going back to my personal work experience, especially in the early days, um, we were we were creating as an accountant, I was creating on a monthly basis a month-end close pack.
Yeah,
And the pack that would normally PowerPoint was an output.
yeah,
It was a physical thing that you could, easy to tick and say, look, I've done my job, I've produced the pack. But what we're saying with Agile is, well, fine, you've delivered the output, the pack, but does that help you deliver the outcome, which is the thing that you want to improve, or the thing that you want to solve, or whatever it is? And my personal experience was that every time we had a new executive or stakeholder, or every time even the same executive stakeholder would create new questions, and so the pack would just be added to. We would
Absolutely,
then
yeah.
add slide 3, slide 4, slide 20, slide 20, 31, and so on. And we'd never seem to take anything away. And I would sit there going, surely there is no way, given the number of people in the room, because there were about 30 of us accountants working together in this particular business, each one of us creating our own pack for our own part of the business. And there was no way that people were actually reading all of this, and certainly not getting the sort of value
Yeah.
that they needed to make decisions about what to do next. So that's what I mean by outcomes versus outputs, is what are we creating that has value, that creates change, that has an impact.
Yes.
And often it's not an output. It could be something else. It could be a different way of communicating that information that isn't a pack of some kind.
Yeah, and there's
For example.
often a tendency in a job to get kind of focused on the outputs,
Mhm,
let's get this job out the door type
mhm.
thing. So how does an accountant who's a member of a team or whatever, how do they start focusing away from just the outputs that they're
Mm,
creating to outcomes? How do they raise that discussion up to the team, for example?
sure. Um, so first of all, I think it requires a little bit of courage. I've got to be honest, to start having these conversations. But I think if we can discuss what are we actually getting from the pack, is it not in a complaining kind of a way, not in a, well, there's no point in doing this because no one is reading it kind of
Yeah.
vibe, but
Mhm.
actually say, what actually do people need to make the why are we creating these packs? Because people want information, they want to be able to make decisions, they want to be able to control how money is flowing, basically. So let's go back to our fundamental reasons, our principles around why we're doing the thing. And then we can talk about, well, in that case, do we need all 31 slides, or actually, which are the slides that you need right now? We can always add another slide back later, but what if we had something more impactful? The way I would sell it to my team and to my supervisors and the stakeholders would be that uh, we, the accountants, with our insights and our ability to make sense of financial information, we could probably help our business units a lot more if we had a bit more time to sit with them and talk with them and help them with the decisions that they're making. And so I would probably start from that point and say, to create that time in order for me to help the business unit, how about I spend less time
Yeah, good point.
doing this, and let's do it in the following way. And why don't we experiment for a couple of months and see how it feels? So I would sort of, that's probably how I'd approach it, but it would depend on which team I was working with. But probably the teams I can think of that I worked with, that where we were reasonably successful, that's probably how I would have approached it with them had I known about this back then.
That is definitely a discussion you need to have with your kind of stakeholders, and
For sure.
obviously
Yeah.
not something you can decide on your own. Let's reduce this to 5 slides.
No, no, not unless you're a one-man band.
Okay, let's move on to one of the other elements then. The third element you have is called evidence.
Mm.
How would a small or a medium-sized business gather evidence? What does evidence mean for that kind of business? And how do we avoid that being too resource intensive when we're limited by number of people?
So it's interesting. That's an interesting one, and I think when we talk about evidence, we start to think of data, and when we start to think of
Yeah.
data, we nowadays start to think of big data, and we start to think of that, and we think of everything else that goes with it. I think to start with, what I'm really, I think, trying to say is, let's if you've got a hunch about something, or if you've got a gut feeling about something, that's okay. But can you back that up in some way with some form of evidence? It doesn't need to be chapter and verse. It doesn't need to be the whole, scientifically proven over 4 years, or not, you need 8 doctorates or something. But is there something that supports what you're thinking or what you're feeling? And it could be a conversation. So, for example, is this marketing strategy that I have for my book a good idea? Well,
Mhm.
I can go out and get a ton of research done, or I could ask a few key people that I know who are in that field, who understand a few things, and and probably
Yeah.
asking 4 or 5 people would be enough for me to get enough evidence to say, yeah, this is worth pursuing, this is worth trying, this is worth an experiment.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm talking about, but not just always saying, no, it's definitely got to be blue, right? We've got to, whatever we do, it's got to be blue. So, well, why has it got to be blue? Because I like blue. It's got to be more than that. It's got to be, well, because a little bit of research shows us that every time we use the color blue, this happens. So then you go, okay, that makes sense. Let's
Yeah.
let's go with that. There's something to support the feeling.
And that ties in with the agile concept of iteration, isn't it? Kind of moving forward a step to gather some information, and that
Yeah,
allows you to make the next decision to move forward another step,
exactly.
rather than eating the elephant all at once. We take it bite by bite.
That's exactly right.
Right. One of my favorite quotes in the book is from your seventh element, which is called Decisions at Source. I'm going to read it here. It says, move decisions to the information rather than bring the information to the decision maker.
Mm.
How can that work in practice in the business?
Sure. Yes, so that's a quote which comes from the work of Dave Marquet, who wrote "Turn the Ship Around." That is he talks a lot about that, and there's a lot of great information about how he does that on the submarine that he's on. In that book, he explains that in some detail. But what I'm talking about here from a business perspective is that the the problems that we are trying to solve are best understood by the people working on the problems, not necessarily by the people who are 4 or 5 levels removed, who are the leaders. We need the leaders to do their job, but they're probably not best placed always to solve the problems on the ground because they don't have all the facts and all the information about it. And if we use a quick military analogy, and we'll come back to a business one in a second, but to use a military analogy, if we have an overall objective, the overall outcome is to, basically take control of a particular hill that we can see. What we do is we make sure that the information is passed down to the people who are going to do that work, who are going to do that assault, and give them the context and the clarity as to what needs to happen and why. But then we need to trust them to actually deliver that outcome based on what they actually experience as they're moving forwards, because they will come across blockers and obstacles that the leaders can't perceive or can't even necessarily predict. So that's what I mean by allowing the people who are doing the work to make the decisions, because they're the ones who have the information about what needs to happen next.
Yes. And I don't necessarily disagree with you, but you're essentially talking about turning the organization upside down, aren't you? Instead of
Sure.
line managers and department managers, you're saying the people at the front should make the decisions, which presumably means they should be paid appropriately according to their decisions, and would need a higher level of training or professionalism than might currently be the case.
Um, that's interesting. I haven't sort of gone in, sort of thought about it in those sorts of terms. Um, but for me, it's about, are there decisions that at my current skill level, at my current pay grade, are there certain decisions that I could make which would lead to the best possible outcome? which doesn't require me to write a report, send it to my
Yeah.
supervisor, who sends it to the manager, who sends it to the executive, who sends it to the board, and then comes back down again. Um, and I think that there are probably, if I have enough clarity and context, if I understand what we're trying to achieve and I understand why we're trying to achieve it, and I have a place where I can ask questions, I can probably, with my colleagues, help solve the smaller problems. Not about the direction of the company, not about our hiring strategies or anything like that. Not those things which are the responsibility of others to think about. I'm talking about the work that's in front of me. So I wouldn't necessarily say that I would need to be better skilled or to be paid more. I would need the environment and the encouragement and the context to be able to be allowed to make decisions. And I think um, my life experience at work would improve because I would then sort of be experiencing a sense of autonomy, and I would be experiencing a sense of a sense of satisfaction from the fact that I'm actually engaging my brain in the process rather than just doing what I'm told.
Yes. Needs pretty good communication and feedback loops, though, to keep everyone involved, understanding, and also that, some of these decisions at the front line might have knock-on consequences elsewhere in the organization.
No, absolutely. And there are methods and processes that exist, and Dave Marquet talks about a couple of ideas as to how we make sure that the person making that we're asking to make those decisions, that they have the competency
Yes.
and they have the clarity and the context. So he puts those onto a sort of a chart and says, you need sort of competency here, clarity and context here, and you need to have both at the same time. And there are ways of asking questions and observing where you can build confidence and trust in the abilities and the capabilities of the people. And when we do that, although it might take a little bit of extra time to start with, when we do that, we as leaders then free up so much of our
Yeah.
time when we're not then having to make every single decision about everything that is happening, we then don't become the blocker to progress.
Yes.
And there, as I say, there's some great ways to make sure that we don't fall foul of making mistakes and things like that when we're working together in teams where we're communicating well and we can trust each other.
Okay, let's talk about planning. Continuous replanning is one of the themes in element number 12 rather than fixed budgets. So, again, how can we make that work, particularly perhaps in a smaller or a medium-sized business? Moving away from the annual budget sounds rather
Mm.
scary.
It can, can't it? We're so used to doing the things in that way.
Yeah.
Um, Probably to start with, easier for sure with a smaller or medium-sized organization uh, where we can look each other in the eye and we can actually talk about what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve it,
Mhm.
how
Mhm.
much money we actually have to put behind this project, and when it needs to be done by. And I think if we can have those conversations with each other, we can then work out, well, what is the most effective way of delivering this outcome? Do we need to do some, if we can't answer that question, do we need to do some experiments or run some pilots? Or do we need to actually, the amount of planning that we need to do up front will depend in large on complexity, but it will also depend on how much information we have about what we're doing. And so often we have very little information at the beginning.
Yes.
So the idea of continuous replanning is, we hear these numbers bandied around, but it can take 18 months, 6 to 18 months for an organization to prepare its annual budget, which just sounds extraordinary, and is extraordinary. But if you've spent that amount of time preparing a very, very detailed budget, let's say, during 2019, and then a couple of months into 2020, you found yourself unable to do anything that was that was desired from the budget because of what happened with the pandemic. All of that time has been effectively wasted.
Yes.
And whereas if we get into the habit of continuously replanning. In other words, taking the evidence that we talked about earlier from what we've done, what we've created, what we've tried to sell, for example. What evidence do we have? What feedback has come back? What do we need to change in order to progress? As something happens in the world, as something happens to our business, as something happens to us, what do we need to change to make that happen? It doesn't mean that we end up necessarily spending more. I think we actually end up spending less in total, because what happens is we sort of say, right, we had originally allocated £100,000 for this thing. We can't deliver that thing. We've spent 10,000. We've learned something from that, so it's not completely wasted. We've now got 90,000 left. What shall we do with that 90,000? And I think we should be constantly looking at that rather than doubling down, having spent the 10, saying, well, and now we've got to keep going. Well, no, because you could actually pivot and create something far better and far more useful. So often I've seen organizations and teams double down on the original plan and get to the end and deliver something that is no longer needed, no longer wanted, and it works the way it was supposed to because we're intelligent people and we planned it properly, but it wasn't needed anymore. So it's out of date already. So with Agile, I think there is more planning that we do, but it is more relevant and more timely planning that we do. So we're not planning, we're not doing less planning, we're just spending less time at the beginning, and then we are continually reviewing and adjusting as we go. To do that, in terms of budgeting, obviously we need not to necessarily have line items, budget line items, cast in stone, but actually just say, here is a total figure that we know we can't go over. Within that, how are we doing? And coming back to a point we made earlier, if the accountants have more time to spend in the business because they're spending less time preparing a month-end pack each month, then they can actually help the business to make those decisions as we go along. So the elements start to flow, as you can see, with each other, and impact each other in cool ways.
Yeah, and that also links to the point about evidence that you mentioned before. By replanning, we're reassessing our evidence at each stage.
Exactly.
Make a more informed decision for the next stage. Makes more sense than trying to look ahead a year in an uncertain environment.
For sure.
Okay, let me ask you then. One of the most interesting points in the book is this concept of pilots and experiments, which I find really appealing, but it's also a bit of a challenge to an organization, isn't it? Kind of resource intensive. You're potentially, costing you a lot of money to do these experiments, which may come to nothing. So, how do we square that circle or circle that square?
Sure. I think, and for sure, when I first, with my accountant's hat on, with my finance hat on, when I first heard about this, my brain immediately went to, hundreds of thousands of pounds being spent on people just creating, inventing, trying to figure stuff out just for the fun of it. And it all coming to nothing. And then you've spent a lot of money and there is a place, there's a place for that sort of innovation, which is great. But I think in most cases, for most of us, what we're really talking about is what do we need to do to gather enough evidence to be able to decide whether our path is the correct path right now. And if it is very labor intensive, or if it's very money intensive or time intensive to do that experiment, maybe it's not the experiment we should be doing. I think in the book somewhere I say, please experiment responsibly, which by which I mean we should never do anything which, if it fails, it would be catastrophic.
Yes.
So we need to be doing things that that make sense and that work. And most of the time, an experiment can be. And I mentioned this as one of the examples in the book. We were trying to do a particular thing and roll something out, and we were about to spend about £4 million on a particular way of rolling something out. And I just sort of said, well, it looks like from the information, I said, get me some evidence as to why people are complaining. What is the problem? We got enough evidence, just in a quick little report, to suggest that it was because people were not reading the information we were giving them, and that they just needed a bit of handholding, a little bit of comfort. So I suggested, well, instead of can we, before we spend that money and commit to that, can I try something? Can we just do a couple of quick webinars directed at the people who are about to receive this new thing, and then we can and let's see what happens. And so that experiment didn't cost us anything. It cost me a little bit of time, a little bit of thinking.
Yeah.
It didn't actually cost us any money. And the results were immediate. The positive results were immediate. And we just then continued to use that. And we kept using the same process, but each time we made sure that it was still relevant, so
Yeah.
that we were ready at any point to switch tack. So many of our experiments don't have to be very expensive, and they shouldn't be taking a lot of time. It's really about saying, well, could this work? Could this crazy idea work? How can we test it in a way that doesn't, you know, doesn't lead to a catastrophe somewhere? And very often there are some great little things we can do if we put our minds to it.
So try something safe to, find out a bit of information and then take stock and try something else.
Yeah, we're not.
Rather
Yeah,
than,
exactly. Rather than we need to build a whole laboratory and move, 40 geniuses into it, and there
yeah.
is there is a time and a place for that, and that's great. And there are organizations who can afford to do that. But for most of us, I'm talking about, well, instead of committing to doing something in a particular way, I think this is what I mean by pilots and experiments. Instead of committing absolutely to doing something in a given way, why don't you commit to see whether it works?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, is the mindset that I'm proposing.
Mhm.
Because, and if it does work, you continue to do it until it stops working. If it doesn't work, you then are ready to try something else.
Yeah.
And that obviously comes back to the whole point of, well, that's why you don't spend 18 months planning something without running any experiments, because you have no idea whether anything's going to work.
Yeah. What's working, what's not going to work. Yeah. No, that's a good point. I like that. I think one of my favorite titles for your elements is Work Not Done, which is element
Mm.
18. What on earth do you mean by that?
What is work not done? So work not done is, again, this is tied into the planning piece. When we plan a project, or we plan to do a thing, we list out everything that we say we're going to do. We cost it, we get the sign off, and then we go through and we make sure that we deliver everything that we said we're going to deliver. Now, all we're doing if we do that is we're just delivering a whole bunch of outputs.
Yes.
Because what happens is that maybe there are parts of what we thought we needed that we don't actually need anymore. So don't deliver those. If we find we don't need it, don't deliver it. If we find that what we thought was going to be a really good idea turns out not to be a good idea, but there's something else we could do instead, do that. But don't try and keep delivering everything that you said you were going to just because it's on the list. So I'm talking about looking at a list of features or a list of items to be delivered. Think of those as options rather than the list of the things that you need.
Hmm.
And towards the back of the book, I give an example of a big deliverable that we had where we ended up delivering only half of what had been originally asked for, because in doing so, we'd actually delivered over 90% of the value, 90% of the outcomes that we wanted were delivered in the first half of that. So we're able to save a ton of money and a ton of time by doing that. And that's what I'm looking at is, again, this comes back to replanning. This comes back to, again, the elements are
Yeah,
starting to flow into
exactly.
each
Yes.
other as we look at that. And that's how we save a lot of time. And that's how most of in fact, every project that I've been involved with has always been able to deliver it on time for sure, if not ahead of time, and under budget, because we have been really honest about what we don't actually need to do.
Yes. And of course, if we were tied into a fixed budget, there'd be political pressure to spend the budget and do the stuff,
Wouldn't there?
you know. So yes, that again ties back into what you said about replanning and evidence and experiment.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring things to a close. What are your top tips for a business becoming more agile in the sense of your business agility?
Sure. I think the first thing is spend a little bit of time understanding that we are naturally agile and we have lost that agility over time due to society pressures, due to bureaucracies, due to institutions, all sorts of reasons. We kind of lost our way. And we've been doing that for for a very long time. From some of the research I've done, we've probably been imposing bureaucracy on ourselves for over 4,000 years. So it's a big ask for us to change. I get that. But if we observe, and the examples in the book, if we observe ourselves as children and how we do things, and we can and I'm looking at how do we rediscover that agility whilst making sure that we're not losing our ability to manage risk. We're not losing our ability to, to do all the things that we need to do. The reason bureaucracy is there is to keep us safe.
Yes.
It's the reason for it. It's not it's not there just to punish people all the time. It's there for a reason. But can we be agile without that? And I think if we understand the psychology, the neuroscience, the ways of working, and all of those examples that I'm trying to bring to the fore, we can then start to approach that. So first thing is understand that we are naturally agile, and all I'm doing is suggesting that we rediscover that. Next thing is do it one at a time. Don't try and do all this in one go. Pick an element that sounds really obvious and just run an experiment with it, run a pilot, and if it works, then roll that out and then move on to the next one. So I would say, do it in those steps. There's a domino effect. So by the time you've probably been through about somewhere between 3 and 5 elements,
Mm-hmm.
probably the rest of them will probably fall into place without any effort. And so that would be sort of my second point. My third point is the mere fact that you are observing what we're doing now and really thinking about it, your brain will start to figure out whether there's a better way.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And allow your brain to do that. Allow your brain to sometimes solve things without any time or money being invested, because our brains are extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think a theme that comes across to me, certainly from the book, is the idea of keep reviewing what you're doing, kind of frequent review, meet together as a team.
Mhm.
This is the replanning, this is the evidence, this is, all of this. Meet to discuss what we've done, how well have we done, what have we not done, what's been a barrier to us, how can
Yeah,
we resolve that and move ahead, kind of step
yeah,
by step, gather evidence, discuss it, collaborate, move another step.
absolutely, absolutely right. And I think if we get into the habit of doing that and we see the value of that, when we have major step changes of improvement with that, it then becomes exciting and we look forward to it. A note though on that is that at some point, if your team is really getting good at working together, really good at collaborating, really good at communicating, what you may find is that you don't need to set some time aside for that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And that's
mm-hmm.
when things are really interesting, because what happens is you are constantly looking to improve all the time,
Yeah.
and you do it on the fly. It happens whilst you're working. You don't need to then be taking time out and do it. But to start with, for sure, you need to take time out to stop and think. But then eventually you'll be in a situation where you don't have to do that anymore, and it just happens naturally, and that's exciting.
Okay, perfect. What a great place to start. So the book is The Key Elements of Business Agility. Lots of good ideas in there. Thank you for your time, Alice.
Thank you, Ross. Amazing.